Hello pilots and welcome to a new video. This time we are looking into manual PID tuning of INAV fixed wings. I've talked about that a few times in the past, and finally I had the opportunity to do it actually in field and also do some recordings. And before we start to go fly, I will show you a few things in the configurator we have to adapt before we tune it manually. And then we go to the field and I show it to you on a live flight. This is especially important on INAV 4.0. With the next INAV release, feed forward and rates will still be tuned by Autotune, but not the PI and D values. They will stay stock like the initial setup, and we can tune them to our likings, to our feel we want to get from the plane. But they are not changed anymore in Autotune. So let's jump right in and stay tuned. Before we can start with the actual tuning process, we have to check a few parameters in INAV. In this case, I show you the changes in INAV 4.0, but on 3.0, it's exactly the same process. If you have previously updated INAV from an older version and you have transferred all your diff and all the tuning parameters from the older version, then I recommend you to load the INAV defaults to start all over again before you initiate the manual tuning. If this is a complete new setup with a fresh flight controller, you can skip this next step and you don't have to do that at all. To reload the old settings, we have to go to the command line interface in INAV 4.0. In 3.0, this is not necessary. You can go through the presets tab there and load just one of the default presets. To do it in the command line interface, we type in set applied _ defaults equals 0. And what this does is it sets a flag in the INAV configuration that tells the configurator that this is a completely fresh board with no configuration done yet. But no worries, your configuration is not lost. It's just a basically cheat code to trick the configurator to bring up the initialization pop-up menu on the next connect. As in INAV 4.0, the presets tab here on the left side is not there anymore. We have to do this way for now. It might be that we will get a button back to get this pop-up again, but for now this is the option we have to use in 4.0 with the developer version. So after we hit enter at this point, this value is stored, and then we just have to type save and hit enter again to change the value in the configuration storage and reboot the board. The reboot just takes a few seconds, and after the flight controller is reconnected again, you will see the initial setup pop up here again, and we can select our preset. In this case, I use the ZOHD drift, so I select airplane with tail as a preset. Then it takes another few seconds to apply all the settings of the default values again, and then the board will reboot automatically and we have all the defaults loaded. After the reboot is completed and all the defaults are loaded, we can look at the settings we need for our manual tuning. As you can see here on the right side, all pre-flight checks in my case are fine again, so we know that our settings are still there. And as a first step, we go into the configuration tab. Here we need to make sure one setting is enabled, and that's the continuous trim servos on fixed wing option. This manages the automatic servo trim, so the integral value of the PID FF controller has less work to do, and this will help us with the tuning later, but I will show you that when we are actually in flight. The second value we want to check now is in the advanced tuning tab, and that's the setting for the control smoothness. Here we want to make sure that we disable that, set that to 0. The reason for that is that with my method of manual tuning, that includes the angle mode and also, of course, navigation mode like cruise for navigation testing. We want to make sure that the control smoothness is not artificially smoothing out our plane behavior, so we completely or directly see what the actual PIDs are doing all the time. Then we just hit save and reboot again and reconnect to the board. Next things we check now are completely optional, and what I recommend to do is install the OpenTX Pro model we have developed in the INAV fixed-wing group, and we want to check the settings there now too. I will also link in the video description the video from Darren Lines, who has a very great video description how to install and use the OpenTX Pro model on your radio. And with that, you can completely do the manual tuning in flight without landing every time you want to change a value. And this is how that looks like. So you have your adjustments. We have 20 different values here in the adjustments list we can change in flight. And I scroll slowly here. You can just pause to see what values are changeable in this screen. Of course, you can change it for your liking if you want to tune or adjust other values in flight, but these are the ones that are included in the OpenTX Pro model. It's not completely up to date on the website yet, but I will talk to Darren to do that and change it to these values you see here. And the second part of this in-flight tuning is the OSD screen. I have here the third alternative layout number 3. And if you go there, you see all the in-flight tunable values I have set up here. We have the PIDs at the top and some navigation values to tune here at the bottom half of the screen. So after this is all ready, we can now go to the field and start flying. Here we are now on the test spot. I have the ZOHD Drift with me. That is also the plane I just showed you with INAV 4.0. What settings have to be set for the manual tuning. And we will get this in the air now, and I will show you step by step how the manual tuning process is done. So now we are in the air. And this is all on INAV 4.0 default values. And it already looks pretty good and stable. For now we have to fly in Acro mode just for a moment and do some dead stick flying. So you release the sticks and just let the PID controller do its thing. So the continuous servo trim can trim the control surfaces for the set throttle value. Then we switch quickly into a manual mode, check how the trim worked. In this case, it still pulls a little bit up on the pitch axis. It's not too bad, so just to make sure we switch back into Acro mode again and let it do a little bit more time on the trimming. And now in manual mode, it's still slightly nose up, but that's totally fine now. So after this is done, we have our final trimming, and this is important for the next steps, so we can start with the tuning. First of all, we have to do an Autotune. The important thing here is that we get the rates and the feed-forward values. In this INAV 4.0 version I have here installed the new changes not implemented yet, that the PID values are not changed. This is planned for the future, so in INAV 4.0 only feed forward and rates are changed, but PID values are not touched. So we set our throttle a little bit higher than our normal cruise throttle, a very good stable speed. And then we start with our Autotune movements, in this case long up and down strokes. And we see the feed forward value on the pitch axis starts to adjust, and also the stabilized pitch rate in the lower left corner of the top block goes to 120, so 120 degrees per second. And if we see that feed forward and the stabilized pitch rate are not changing anymore, we are done with that axis. Then we can do the same with the roll axis, get some altitude, and we can either make complete rolls or just left-right rockings. In this case, I start with left-right because it's very slow, but now the rate gets very high, so it's better to do full rolls in this case. On this location I also had to watch my altitude, because a few kilometers, 7 or 8 kilometers away, there is a little private or a little hobby airport, and they are doing some training flights right now also in this area, so I try to stay low in this case. So yeah, I do some more pitch tuning here with a hard turn, a few more rolls. Yeah, as aggressive as the plane allows. And after that, the auto-tune is complete. What I also did do here is I have to check in the manual mode that the plane is completely stable on aggressive inputs. Usually you should do that before you do the auto-tune. I forgot it in this case, and so we do it now afterwards. So depending on how you want to fly this plane, at least you should be able to do full pitch turns. So you do a turn with full pitch, you do a roll, whatever you want, just aggressive inputs with full pitch and full roll, and you should never lose control over the plane. It should not stall or roll to the side if you pitch up. This is really important before you actually start the auto-tune. But I knew on this plane this worked before, because it was already airborne, so it's on the hardware side it's set up very well already. So at this point, part 1 of the manual tuning process is done, basically the automatic part. Now we can start the manual PID tune. For that, I start with the angle mode. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that the navigation modes are tuned well, and all navigation modes base on the angle mode as a baseline. They are all self-leveling. So I switch into self-level, I have manual tuning active, and the first thing I do is set the integral value completely to 0 now. We have the automatic trim already done. So the continuous servo trim is now disabled, and also the attitude hold in Acro mode is disabled. Now in angle mode, we start with rapid and strong stick inputs. On the pitch axis, every time you center the stick, you see we have a slight overshoot, a little bit soft. On the roll axis, it looks pretty well. So that means that the feed forward values are pretty much spot on, so the plane moves exactly that fast on this axis as the flight controller expects it to be. But on the pitch axis, it overshoots a little bit, maybe due to inertia, maybe a little bit off in the feed forward value, maybe a little bit too low. But what we do now is we start to play with the p-value. I raise the p-value now from the initial value from the tune of 11 up to 20. And as you can see, if I now pitch up and down, it still overshoots a little bit, but it's now much smaller and a little bit sharper. As you can see, the overshoot when it centers is now smaller than before. Actually, the auto-tune with zeroed out integral is already working pretty well on the drift. Maybe the drift was not the best example plane to do this, but we want to see how stiff we can do it, and I can still demonstrate you how the different values behave. So let's do just a quick return to home test just to check if that works. And if the navigation mode is stable, you see complete stable and rock solid turn, absolutely fine. That means the feed forward values and the rates are absolutely on spot in this case. So we just need to tune the PID stabilization. Now I can also check the cruise mode and do the same. Sharp turns in cruise mode with maximum stick input. And you see it's absolutely locked in. And this again proves that the feed forward values are on spot. So the expected rates and commanded rates, the commanded rates and executed rates are matching very well. There's still some overshooting on the pitch axis. So what I try now is with a higher p-value, you see the centering of the pitch axis is now more aggressive than before. And let's check roll again. Roll is very soft at the moment, so that that shows again that low p-values give you a soft tune, higher p-values give you a more sharp tune, also in navigation modes. So here you see with a higher p-value, the centering back or the reaction to the stick in angle mode is a little bit more aggressive, is a little bit more faster, but still very soft. And here you see when I fly lower, there is a slight wind at the moment that comes from the direction of the trees. And you see it's still pretty wobbly. But if I raise the p-value, then the movements induced by the wind are sharper, but not as big as before. Okay, so at this point with the angle mode, we see that the feed forward values are on spot, and we can go up to 25 in this case, maybe even higher with the p-value if we just want to use navigation modes to have a very locked in behavior. But now, as I want to fly this plane mainly in Acro mode, you see if you switch to Acro mode and do very strong inputs, you see these oscillations after stopping a roll. It's very sharp because of the high p-value, but it is there, and this is showing me that the p-value is actually too high at this point. Now what we try is I try to dampen these oscillations with the d value, with the derivative value. And you see the oscillations get smaller and get less in numbers. So, and we have to be careful at this point. If you raise the d value too high, then you get d-induced oscillations. So the d is very sensitive to vibrations or noise. And it can even self-induce just by the control surface movement itself. Just the small movements the control surface reaction induces into the plane, not even from the airflow, can already induce oscillations on the d value. So we have to be careful how high we go with d. And in this case, with a d value of 15, it was right at the edge, so I couldn't go any higher. So I decided to go down into a safe space, down to 10 with that. And then we can lower down the p-value again to reduce the oscillation so much that the d value can actually still smoothen them out. Sounds a little bit complicated, but basically higher p means sharper response with overshooting. D dampens, but the damper has its limit, and if we reach the limit of the D dampening, then we have to lower P to completely eliminate the oscillations on the axis or the overshoots on the axis. As you can see now, with these values of P15 and D12, we have a very strong locked-in roll axis, but I think it's still a little bit too high, but let's look at the pitch axis next. So here on the pitch axis, it's already pretty good and pretty locked in. I think that's basically the natural stability of the plane. Let's quickly fly behind these trees a little bit where we have some turbulences. Yeah, there's very little to do on the pitch axis already, even with this high P value. We can use some D here additionally to have a little bit softer ending. There was a very slight overshoot on the pitch still in Acro mode, so just adding a little bit of D helps a lot and makes it very locked in at this point. But no, I'm not very happy with the roll axis here, so let's reduce the D value a little bit because it felt a little bit too sharp with a slight jitter at the end, and then also reduce P a little bit more. So this is much better now. You can see we have a very, very sharp stop and start of roll maneuvers, and also pitch is completely locked in. So in short, higher P value, more stick response, and more wind stabilization. With the D value, you're dampening the oscillations or the overshoots of the P, but for the D value, you are limited how much you can actually use. So if you cannot go higher with D, you have to reduce the P value to go in a range where D is still effective enough. What's important and what you have to keep in mind is if you have very fast and very precise servos, you can use higher P and D values on your plane actually, because they can react faster. If you have slow servos or cheap servos with some slack in the gears, you cannot use so high P or D values, because then the delay between the sensor measurement and the output and the change of the value is too big, and if the delay gets too big, the PID controller cannot work with these sharp inputs, so the PID controller has to act smoother. So, and what you can see all the time now in Acro mode, I'm constantly compensating for drifting away of the plane, because we disabled the integral value, and the integral value gives us the actual attitude log of Acro mode. But we want to make sure that this is as low as possible, because currently in INAV, at least in INAV 3.0, the integral value causes some bounce back, because if you suddenly stop center the stick and the plane is still rotating, it will bounce back to the position where it was when you released the sticks. So I just fly in Acro mode right now, again with 50% throttle, and then I add a slight bit of integral value until the plane does not drift or on pitch or the roll axis anymore. You see with the roll value of 3, roll gets pretty much locked in. Very slightly, not too stiff, just the bare minimum. And here if I go full throttle now, you see that the continuous servo trim takes a while until it trims with the low integral value, and the integral value itself is too weak to compensate for that, for these speed changes. So the next thing what I do is I switch between full throttle and glide flight and look if the plane drifts away on the pitch or on the roll axis. And then I raise slightly the integral step by step, just until the plane barely keeps its attitude, even when I change between full and zero throttle. And here you see on the roll axis now with an integral value of 4, I get some slight bounce back now if I stop a roll very fast. So let's try to go down to 3 again. So you see now when I released the throttle and started to glide, the plane started to roll to the right. And now if I go full throttle, the plane starts to roll to the left. And the integral is too weak now to compensate for this in real time. So we have to wait for the continuous servo trim to actually work. and this will then over time compensate, but that takes a little bit longer. So let's keep the integral on the roll axis on 5. That should be strong enough to compensate for the changes between fast and slow flying in real time, and the continuous servo trim is then doing the rest. So on pitch we can try again here. You see, from glide to full throttle, pitch were pretty stable with an integral value of 4. That's totally fine. So now we have the integral value also tuned on the bare minimum that's really needed to keep the plane stable. In theory, you can still set it down to 1 to just have the trimming. If your plane is by design very speed tolerant, I would say. So if it stays at its attitude no matter how fast you fly. But that's usually never actually the case, because the aerodynamics or the lift on the wings just have to change if you change speed. You have to trim every time. But as you can see, now we can fly some acrobatics with that plane. It's completely locked in. Just a slight breeze that causes some influence. But beside that, it's completely locked in and very nice to fly. The last time I did that was on a drift with about 20 to 30 kilometers per hour wind, and I was pretty much surprised how well that actually worked. So let's land and make the final statement. So this was phase 1 of the manual tuning process. What we have done so far is we have tuned the feed forward value and the rates by using Autotune. In INAV 4.0, this will be this should be the only things that will be tuned by Autotune. The PIDs will stay at default values. And then we have completely manually tuned the P, I, and D values. As a summary, what we do during the manual tune, first of all, we set the integral value to 0 after the plane is automatically trimmed by the auto servo trim, just to have it not messing around with our plane behavior, and so we can get a plane P and D response. Then we raise the P value until we get a very nice and sharp stick response with small overshoots and no big oscillations anymore. After that, we raise the D value to dampen the P, so we reduce the sharp oscillations or the stop oscillations after a rotation. But if the D value is too high, then we have to lower it again or keep it at its limit or below its limit. Otherwise, we will induce very strong and fast permanent oscillation that can even damage your servos. And if the overshoot caused by P is still there, then we have to lower P to adapt it to the maximum D value we can use until we get a nice, sharp, and soft stick response in any situation. And after that is done, we can tune our integral value. Actually, we could, in theory, completely disable it to have a more manual-like feeling and very little stabilization or attitude hold. But this will also disable the continuous servo trim. If you keep the integral at a very low point or at the lowest possible point, as I have shown, then, in my opinion, you get the best of both worlds. You get a constant attitude hold, constant automatic servo trim, and still no issues with overshooting or with bounce backs. One thing I couldn't demonstrate on this plane in this case is if the feed forward value is too high, tuned by the Autotune. This can happen on some planes. Then you will see a very specific behavior, especially on the pitch axis. If you fly in angle mode and you pitch up the plane and then you release the stick, it will not go smoothly back to the center point, but it will make like a stepping. So it goes to very fast at first, then it stops or at least slows down, and then slowly goes to the final center point. This happens if the feed forward value is too high and the plane actually responds faster than the PID controller is expecting. So the P value is fighting back to stop the fast motion. If this is the case, just lower the feed forward value until the plane is going back to level in a smooth way. Unfortunately, I was not able to do more recordings today to already record the other tuning phases. The next things will be pitch to throttle ratio and TPA tuning, for example, because my VTX in the drift died, but this will come soon in the next videos. Yeah, I hope you learned something today, and if you liked that video, then please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel to not miss the next videos on that topic, and I will see you soon. Bye bye.